Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Earlier this year, United Educators released a report that listed the top 10 risks facing higher education in 2026. UE provides risk management guidance and liability coverage to thousands of schools across the country. For my listeners, it should come as no surprise that college athletics broke into the top 10. To help us understand both the challenges and risks facing college athletics from UE's perspective, my guest is Melanie Bennett. She is the Senior Risk Management Counsel for United Educators. Melanie provides a lot of guidance and also hosts United Educators podcast, yay, which frequently covers college athletics issues. Melanie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here.
So, for my listeners who may not have even heard of your company, let's talk a little bit about who you are, what you've been doing, how long you've been doing for that type of thing.
Absolutely. So I work at United Educators. We're a company that insures K-12 schools and also colleges and universities. And we insure them across the nation. So I'm located out in Bethesda, Maryland. That's where our office is, but it's nationwide. And I've been at United Educators for almost exactly 12 years now,
Okay.
working in the risk research department. So I'm a lawyer who advises schools on risk management,
Okay.
which isn't necessarily a topic people know much about. It's a kind of a niche area until you start to hear about it. And then you realize it's everything that's surrounding you. So
That's
I'm
what
in the risk management. Sorry.
I was going to say, that's what I realized when I was reading through your website and also the report that came out in 2026. I was like, wow, this touches so many facets of higher education.
Exactly. And until someone explains it to you, you don't understand it. And then once you start digging in, it touches everything that we're doing. And it's a great way to look at how people are solving these problems.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really what I want to try to talk about today in this very uncertain landscape for both higher ed and college athletics. So let's just start with a basic question. How do the lists get generated?
So we provide liability insurance for K-12 schools and colleges and universities. Annually, we survey our membership. So we ask them about their perception of top risks on campus. So as I mentioned, we have K-12, we have higher ed, and this is talking about our higher ed report, but there is a separate K-12 report as well. This year, my colleague, Lindsay Dunn, created the reports. So some of the risks that we saw on that list include admissions and retention. That was the top of the list. Data security and cybersecurity, which probably isn't a surprise to anybody that's on the list. Compliance, generally. So not specific to Title IX, not specific to VAWA. Those were a different category.
Okay.
Operational pressures, facilities. Another interesting one this year and something we're watching is deferred maintenance.
Yeah.
That's an issue where there's just so much happening on campus. There are so many new facilities being created. It's hard to maintain the older facilities. It's hard to pay attention to the older facilities, but it's incredibly important because if nobody's paying attention, it can crumble, issues can occur, and
Absolutely.
nobody realizes it until it's too late.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So those make sense to me, and I would think many of those things also apply to athletics. We have enormous amount of technology and just data gathering that's going on in college athletics that we want to be sure that we're not, violating anybody's right to privacy or, God forbid, having a data breach, those kinds of things. So I would imagine that you look at that now across the landscape. Talk a little bit about, if you can, some of the things that athletics people mentioned when they were talking about the risks that they were seeing.
Absolutely. So as you can imagine, a lot of it's related to, as we mentioned, the house settlement and NIL. And I'll say we asked more specific questions about that to find out what they're seeing. And we heard that they are about over 50% were experiencing some effect to their athletics programs based on the NIL regulations. Interesting. Within those affected, only about 10% expressed strong concern regarding it as a potential risk. I wonder if that's going to increase this year. as
Okay.
people are really going through it and feeling it. So that's just something to watch. But in addition to house and revenue sharing, which we'll come back to, there's so many other types of athletics risks that we're seeing. So one that I want to mention is what I'll call illness and injury. Concussions and TBIs, which were such a major issue we were all talking about for a long time, continue to be a major issue. But with NIL, I don't know that we're talking about it as much, and we need to keep paying attention there. Heat illness and rhabdomyolysis, drowning. We've got all these potential illnesses and injuries, and we've seen how institutions can take actions to help prevent them or to help respond to those potential risks. So, 5 areas that institutions can take action include conducting pre-participation screening, considering releases and assumption of risk forms, ensuring access to emergency equipment, publicizing emergency action plans, and training students and staff,
Mhm,
which
mhm.
all sound easy on there looking right at them. But when we dig a little deeper, there are things that schools should be paying more attention to that you may not notice otherwise. So,
Okay.
with releases and assumption of risk forms, you want to make sure you're working with your general counsel. Do you need a release? Do you need an assumption of risk? What's the difference between the two? Is the language correct? You don't want every athlete signing the exact same release. That's
Interesting.
meaningless. It needs to be narrowly tailored to what they're doing.
That's actually very interesting because I'm not sure I've seen that anywhere I've worked. I think they've all been given the same form to sign under the same circumstances. So, is that something that you would strongly advise college presidents to pay attention to, that the risk forms should reflect the dangers of the sport as well as potentially the condition of the facility, the staffing available at that facility, whether, let's say, it's a campus owned facility versus a rental facility off campus? Talk a little bit about those kinds of things.
Sure. So let me start by saying I am a lawyer, but I'm not providing legal advice here.
Okay, fair enough.
But as an insurance company, we absolutely recommend that releases are narrowly tailored to the activity itself. What does that? So presidents should be advising athletic departments to work with general counsel and not just create their own one size fits all release that they think is correct, because that could have later ramifications. If it doesn't actually do anything, then you're spending a lot of time on something that's not helping you. And narrowly tailored looks like looking at the issues with that specific activity. So, for example, if somebody's playing soccer, then you're probably going to want to highlight the risks of concussion and TBI. You're going to want to highlight the risks of playing outdoors and potential heat illness. So, you're going to want to highlight those specific risks of that activity as opposed to athletics in general. You could get injured, there could be deathly consequences. That's probably not narrowly tailored.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, I think that's really interesting because so many times when I sat through these as a coach, as an administrator, you just have the beginning of the year meeting and everybody just signs their forms, gives them back, and then they move on to the things that are most important, like when the next practice is, right? But the way these forms are written not only protects, but also exposes the institution to potential liability. And I want to go back to what I mentioned earlier about this fact that so many of our campus practices and games can be off site. You're in shared facilities, you're in rented facilities, you're arriving when the field wasn't left in good condition. So you have to kind of straighten up as a coach and figure it out. How can institutions deal with this kind of shared spaces that you have in terms of maintaining the safety, but also protecting the institution in terms of its athletes and coaches?
Love that question, especially because I think there's so much going on that it gets lost in the conversation
Yeah.
often. So that's not necessarily specific to the releases and assumption of risk forms. It's something to talk about with GC for sure, when you're general counsel for sure, when you're having those conversations and building them out. But also it's something to pay attention to when you're looking at access of emergency equipment, when you're looking for emergency action
Yeah.
plans. Are you prepared when you're are you prepared when you're on facilities, which is one thing and hard enough? You want to make sure that each facility has its own preparations, has its own access. But especially when you're traveling, you don't necessarily know unless you're asking what the emergency action plans are. What do you do when you go to somebody else's facility and you're playing a game together? Reach out in advance to find out about their emergency action plans, what needs to happen in that facility. Also, there are potentially emergency equipment that should be coming with you when you're
Right.
traveling.
Right.
Going back to the conversation about heat illness, it's important for many sports to have a tarp or an immersion tub available in case heat illness occurs so you can quickly cool someone down. That can be particularly hard when you're traveling
Yes.
and something you might not think about until too late. So if the other team doesn't have it available and you don't know how to get it, or just generally when you're traveling, is there a way to bring it with you and make sure you have access while you're playing?
I'm so glad you brought that up because it has stuck with me ever since it happened. But there was a University of Maryland football player as a freshman who died of heat exhaustion in spring practice in May. So we don't typically think of May as being a really overly hot, overly humid, but it was one of those days. And the team was forced to relocate its practice quickly, and they did not bring their ice tubes or pools with them. And this particular athlete, his name was Jordan McNair, uh, ended up collapsing on the field and having a body temperature of almost 106 degrees. And eventually he passed away a couple of days later. And it was determined that if they'd had these cooling mechanisms with them, he may have survived. We don't know that for sure. But obviously, very upsetting to the institution, to his teammates, to his family, all of those kinds of things. Yet, this kind of reactionary, oh, quickly, we have to move because construction is still going on longer than we thought. This happens more often than we realize. So I think I really appreciate you addressing that.
And I think it's important. Presidents and boards don't necessarily have to have the information on all of the specific risks and injuries that might happen in athletics, but they need to be aware of the bigger issues that people in athletics have so much that they're focusing on, especially right now with the House settlement, and they may not have enough resources. They may not have enough people working on it. Can be other things can get lost in the cracks. Things that are
Absolutely.
hard enough to track during times that it's not this busy and this hard. And so presidents and boards can help ease that burden and remind the department that this is important. The school sees this as important, and we're going to help put resources towards that.
Yeah, and not just in your high profile sports, across all of your sports is really important. And I think what was so shocking and saddening about Jordan McNair's passing was it happened in a Big Ten football team. Can you imagine how less well resourced other teams at other divisions in Division One, Two, and Three are? And oftentimes, coaches are thinking about the practice, getting everybody to the location, trying to get everybody set up, the field set up. The last thing they're thinking about is what did the training staff bring or not bring with them, which could protect my athletes. So even just reminding coaches of almost like a prep list that you might have to make sure if you change your practice routine in any way, make sure you've covered these areas. Would you say that's fair?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Keeping in mind newer issues that they and you would not have considered in the past. For example, we mentioned for a second, I'll go back to severe weather.
Yep,
Severe weather is becoming a bigger issue because we're seeing more and more campuses dealing with weather issues that they've never experienced before.
that's right.
So that's something important to watch, not just with heat, but also with things like air quality, which is a newer one that we want to be paying more attention to. And so it's important to make part of the process, part of the checklist that you're creating, having someone paying attention to this, having a way to know if there's a notification that somebody should know about, and having procedures in place. What do you do when there is a potential weather event? At what point do you cancel it? Do you bring people somewhere else?
Yeah, I coach field hockey, so it's an outdoor sport, usually on an open field, and it was very often there was no shelter to get to quickly. So either you have to be aware of it so that you can proactively move the teams away, or you just have to hope you can, get into cars or something like that. I mean, it's really and thankfully I've never been part of a program where something like that has majorly happened, but I can see how in our changing climate how things could happen very quickly, and particularly in parts of the country where they're used to high windstorms, so they really get active thunderstorms. It could be a real challenge.
Precisely. And additionally, there are issues that presidents and boards are paying attention to across campus
Yeah.
that also need to be focused on within athletics.
Right. Right.
Looking at hazing. Hazing's been a major issue this year. There was a new federal hazing law put in place at the beginning of last year that means that many schools are restructuring their hazing procedures and training, and athletics as a drop down needs to be prepared, needs to be having those conversations to know what the new procedures are, what the new trainings are, and same with sexual misconduct, and possibly creating training specifically for athletes in these areas. So they know, in addition to what everybody else on campus knows, anything specific to the athletics, working within the athletics department that may be helpful.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I was going to ask you about other kinds of preventative behaviors, trying to anticipate problems you see in schools implementing across the board in athletics.
There are many. So also I want to mention coaches abusing athletes as
Okay.
an issue
Yes.
that we're seeing preventative behaviors around.
Okay.
So coaches abusing athletes doesn't always look the way that people historically have talked about it. We're talking about emotional abuse and physical abuse. And sometimes what coaches learned as players and was acceptable as players, we now would think of as abuse. So that's an important part of that conversation. And more, they may even think it's required to be a good coach. So it's important to have training around coach abuse, what it is for the staff and for the athletes. So everybody understands what qualifies as abuse and what to do when you see it, what to do when
Okay.
somebody reports it to you. In addition to that, it's important to prohibit retaliation,
Mm.
especially in athletics. It can be really hard to report issues you're seeing going on. This isn't specific to coach abuse. This is across the board. When you're in athletics, which can feel like a family, it can
Mhm.
be hard to report when something's going wrong. And so having prohibitions on retaliation, making those clear and enforcing them is particularly important in athletics. In addition to that, you want to make sure you're screening potential coaches, not just for their coaching ability, but
Okay.
for any issues they may have had in the past. Um, this can be a particularly hard one these days when there's so much focus on coaching ability. It can be, and sometimes you're hiring coaches very quickly. So it's important to remember that you want to do the screening also as part of your interviews, asking open ended questions about how they work with athletes and talking to references to find out more about their past behavior.
I am really glad you brought that up because when I talk to college presidents, they oftentimes rely on search firms, particularly at the large institutions. Do you have any sense of what kind of information gathering those presidents are doing when it comes to that? Are they relying on the search firms or we just don't?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that
Okay.
question, but I think it's a great one to bring up in this podcast for presidents to make sure that they are following up with those questions,
Yeah.
making sure that it's not just about coaching ability, but
Yeah.
about the big picture of this coach and their experience in the past.
I know when I was an athletic director and I had certain jobs that were open, I oftentimes got inundated with phone calls. I know you didn't ask, but I'm calling to reference so and so as a potential candidate for your such and such position. He or she is part of this network and I've known them forever and, da, 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 and you should hire them, that type of thing. That is a regular feature in the communities that are built around coaching. I think it's really easy for folks who are ADs and others to get kind of lost in, wow, well, so many people recommended them. I just thought it would be the best thing. Not everybody knows what's going on in those huddles, in those locker rooms, on those away games, like others who may have different viewpoints who didn't call you. So, do you talk at all with folks about, how do you hire and evaluate and maybe terminate coaches who are not following along the risk management guidance that you all recommend?
No, for the most part, because of the nature of the role that I have. But I will say when hiring coaches, when we're talking about screening, one important tool that I'll mention that I think is less talked about in higher ed is the Safe Sport tool. That Safe Sport has lists of coaches who have been investigated and found to violate policies. And that's something you should be looking at when hiring coaches, uh, because they may have worked places in the past that aren't reported on their CV, and you can hopefully find them through that.
Yeah.
Their mental issues in the past.
I'm glad you brought those up. And Safe Sport, I have been familiar with it because of its role in Olympic sport activity. I mean, you're aware of it with swimming and gymnastics and other kinds of things. So it's another resource for presidents and others to take advantage of, besides just relying on the search firm and the interviews and that type of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're looking at a very unsettled environment here, and obviously trying to proactively plan for risk, assess policies, perhaps decide, no, we're not going to cover that because it's just too crazy out there in terms of your insurance and liability policies. How are you all assessing this landscape right now? And what guidance do you provide for those who buy your policies and that type of thing?
The landscape's absolutely uncertain. The good news is working in higher education, we're all very familiar with uncertain landscapes and coming risks and watching for emerging risks that we haven't expected before. So at the moment, I'm watching specific uncertain issues within athletics to see where they may land.
Okay.
For instance, NIL and revenue sharing, let's go back to that.
What?
That's for sure still uncertain. We have the House settlement, but there are ongoing legal actions. There's still no final determination of how this all works.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, some helpful things to do to watch those uncertain risks if you're at UE, if you're at an institution, is to watch what the NCAA is saying. They have frequent updates on this. To watch what the CSC is saying. More recently, the College Sports Commission has been providing updates on how this works, how they think it will work, and what schools should be doing. Talking to other schools is also particularly helpful, finding out what their practices are, how they're making this new year work as a new structure
Yeah.
for NIL and revenue sharing. And hopefully, we're advising everyone to pay particular attention to contracts. There are so many new contracts happening with athletes, happening with coaches in relation to this. There's not a lot of new types of language within those contracts, and we're all figuring out what works best. So going back to talking to your general counsel, making them a great ally. So if you're a president advising the athletic department to
Mhm.
have open conversations with their regular conversations with their general counsel, with their risk management about everything, which is hard when there's so much going on. You kind of want to silo yourself, but I think that's a really good idea.
I do too. I like consultation. I think that's a great idea. Okay, so you talked about house settlement, NIL rev share, but that affects about 80 schools, maybe 85 schools. There are about 1,100 schools in the NCAA. So what should everybody else be thinking about?
Unsettled or ongoing issues that everybody should be thinking about. Let's talk a little about Title IX, because it's rare that I get to this late in a conversation and haven't really got into Title IX.
There you
Title
go.
IX, gender equity in athletics, always important, particularly in this moment of transition, but always important. So everybody should be paying attention to it whenever you're creating big athletics changes. Make sure you're talking to general counsel and making sure that you're fulfilling your Title IX requirements. Also, if you are an NIL school, we don't totally understand at this point the relationship between Title IX and NIL, but there is a relationship. So
Yeah.
talk to your general counsel when you're making NIL changes as well about the potential issues with Title IX and how to make sure you're compliant. Another issue everybody's watching right now is the participation of transgender athletes is up in the air. So institutions, in addition to watching what's happening with that, are making sure transgender athletes and students are supported, regardless of the results of those participation questions.
Okay.
Again, an area to talk with general counsel. There are legal questions that are still open that will be coming this year. Also mention gambling. Gambling's Athletics, it just keeps coming and coming.
I
Gambling's a major issue in athletics this year. NCAA, there were changes coming that didn't watch what's happening with gambling and talk to your general counsel on that. So the big picture advice is working closely with your general counsel and risk management as the program developments, as the programs develop, as these issues continue to change. So
yeah.
you're on top of everything and working together.
Yeah, I think that's all excellent advice, and I would also say that it's a layer of complexity because some of what you described are state laws, not federal laws. So your coaches may come in and say, but it's different in Alabama or it's different in Missouri. And you'll say, yeah, that's the way their state legislature set it up. This is particularly true in NIL, by the way. But it can be very frustrating because there's no national standard. And I know that the NCAA is pushing for that. So that there's some uniformity, but it's got to be very frustrating for schools that compete across state lines and have to compete against athletes that have been recruited differently, rewarded differently, those kinds of things. But let me just say this and remind my listeners that NIL impacts divisions 1, 2, and 3 because all athletes at those levels believe that they have the right now to leverage their name, image, and likeness, which in 40 plus states they do. So being aware of it at that level and the kinds of support, you talk about Title IX, do we give the football team more support than we give the basketball team? Institutionally is important, despite the arguments that folks make is that, well, we have to do more with football because they're the ones who can potentially attract more eyeballs, more donations, those kinds of things. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
That's a tricky trap to fall into. Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you're in some institutions get donations that are directed for specific purposes
Exactly.
to specific sports that makes all of it even more tricky. It's something to pay attention to, especially as a college president, because working within athletics, again, you can get so caught in the day to day, caught up in somebody gave me this donation and they told me this is where it should go. And also, this is the biggest revenue producing sport. So it seems obvious it should go there. And they can
Mhm.
miss out on the gender equity of it all.
That's right. Yeah.
So
That's
college presidents are in a particularly good place to remind athletics periodically of the importance of the big picture, remind the head of athletics to be reminding everyone within the department of the importance of the big picture and making sure that these decisions are made as larger groups, that they aren't siloed off into individual sports that won't necessarily see the effect on other sports. A lot of these decisions not only aren't made in order to make someone else feel bad or not have the same resources, but they're made to help the students. They're made to help the athletes. They just happen to mean that more resources are accidentally going towards one sport than another.
yeah.
So only by continuing to have those larger conversations can we make sure that everybody's getting equity.
Yeah, it's an absolutely great point, and I think every coach, listening to this would say, "I agree." It's really hard when one sport seems to get the focus, and yet our sports matter too, and I think institutionally, you have to kinda set that standard that we're all in this together. Last question. Here's your chance. 1 to 2 pieces of advice for presidents as we navigate this athletic landscape going forward.
The first big piece of advice is ensuring the athletic department is working together with other departments to mitigate risk. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody who's been listening to our conversation. But I
I
do
think
want to go back and highlight it. With
Yep.
so many competing risks to mitigate, it's tempting to work alone. The speed of everything that's happening, it's hard to reach out to somebody where you might have to wait for their response, where there might be red tape when it feels like you can handle it on your own. But taking the time to create the infrastructure between departments has a great payoff. Experts are helping each other and can ease the burden on each other over time. So, yeah, first big picture is encouraging athletics to work across campus with risk management, general counsel, youth protection, IT, anyone who might be able to help with all of the risks that they're carrying.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the second piece of advice is creating reporting mechanisms so that presidents are having these conversations with athletics, are aware of the big picture risks that they're seeing. and upper administration are as well. And so they can help divert those silos, create those connections across campus,
Yeah.
especially, and we didn't really talk about this, but earlier we talked a little bit about enterprise risk management, risks across the campus that people are seeing, departments are seeing. If you have an enterprise risk management uh, program, and everybody should, this can be part of it. The presidents are getting reports from all the departments about the risks that they're seeing and creating an enterprise-wide solution so that risks that are happening in multiple departments, including athletics, can get solutions together.
I think that that is a great piece of advice, and get out of our silos and understand that we all have vested interests in everybody succeeding, and we don't want to see risks impact the whole campus that originated in one or two areas. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Melanie Bennett, thank you so much for offering your insight and guidance to our listeners, our presidents, our folks who want to become presidents, my students, that type of thing. I'm really grateful for your time today.
Thank you, Karen. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you.